To close our morning program, I've asked Professor R. David Lankes to join me for a short interview. One of the library profession's great thinkers and advocates, I could think of few people better, given what's going on in the world and in our nation, and not just in libraries, to help us sort of put a bow on all that we've heard this morning. And a big part of the reason I wanted David to join us is because last year he published this book, Forged in War: How a Century of War Created Today's Information Society, which feels incredibly prescient given current events. From the war in Ukraine to the book banning here at home and propaganda and the rise of misinformation, also here at home, the book explains so much about how we approach our information landscape and why it matters. R. David Lankes is the Virginia and Charles Bowden Professor of Librarianship at the University of Texas at Austin School of Information. He's the author of numerous books in addition to Forged in War, including a touchstone in library education, the Atlas of New Librarianship. David, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So in Forged in War, you wrote at length about propaganda and misinformation. And when the Russian attack on the Ukraine began, I kept coming back to the book because the kind of unprovoked attack that is going on in Ukraine by the Russians simply doesn't happen without the Russian government's control of the information landscape. And at the same time, I've marveled at how the Ukrainians have been getting their message out to the world. So as someone who has really deeply studied the information world, can I get you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing today in that situation in Ukraine, in Russia?
It's fascinating because what we're seeing on the Russian side of the equation is the traditional view of propaganda, the idea that it's very much linked to misinformation. It's linked to sort of the outcome of people in power. It is the idea of crafting a message often by creating alternate realities and grounding where you want. So that to me, I think is not a very new story. I think the news stories actually is looking at what the Ukraine is doing, looking at what happens when a media-savvy president and a media-savvy government gets into this horrible situation and realizes that their communication, how they communicate, what they communicate, the faces they put in front of it, looking at it as creating an identifiable method, putting real pain in people's eyes. I think we really see this sort of counter argument to propaganda, right? It's always been the idea of, well, propaganda is a matter of let's get more information, let's get the right information. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is a masterclass of people saying, no, we need to explain people, make it very clear, but we also need to make it very human. We need to show a toll that's going on. And we do that by telling the truth, but also knowing where to focus the lens and the camera. So it's almost going back, if you will, a century or two to what propaganda used to be, which is how do we build up a national identity in a positive way. And so it is interesting to see these two forces at play. And it's also very much a matter of how we've seen an international audience, including the US, be drawn in and creating these human connections and being brought into these connections. And so we've seen a radical change in how we look at refugee populations, how we look at displacement. Now, there are unfortunately some major systemic overtones to how we're seeing that. I mean, we are seeing the Ukrainian population get a lot more sympathy than we were seeing Middle Eastern populations, than we were seeing African populations. And I think that tells us a lot about sort of the structures that we have built into our media and communications. But absolutely, we're seeing very much a standard formulaic propaganda mechanism move forward, but it's being blunted by a new script on how to create an international movement and connect people in through the horrors, but creating that in a way that people can connect to and not necessarily look away from.
You know, I hear so many people wonder how in this information age with social media and the internet, how the Russian people still can't see the truth, at which point I think about the January 6th insurrection and claims of a stolen election and QAnon. You know, help us make sense of this, right? When we spoke last year, you talked about something that you called censorship by noise. Explain that.
So censorship by noise is the idea that the truth is out there, but the way to obscure it is not necessarily to silence it, but to create so much confusion, alternative narratives, other things and other things to pay attention to, that the truth often gets drowned out, that you simply can't necessarily understand exactly what to focus on. And it's creating parallel stories, ones that use the same facts but just veer it slightly, and sometimes it's just creating an alternative reality to go ahead. I think though what we're seeing here when we look very much at what's going on in Russia and looking at how the media is controlled, it's not so much this idea of censorship through noise. What we're seeing is the reality of the great promise of the internet come to a screeching halt. When you looked at forerunners and forethinkers and the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Barry and all these people looking at the internet as a way of as a liberating force, looking at it as a way of preventing these kinds of nationalistic and jingoistic messages from making it through, what we've seen, and we see it, the story before Russia was very much about China, which is that this technology is not inherently liberating, that there are certainly mechanisms in what goes through how we can control a message, how we can control who has access to what systems, how we can filter those messages, that is very much, sorry to refer back to the book, but even looking back in World War I, how the British treated the then internet, which was our telegraphy network, and how they could control what went on that wire service and what was picked up in news. And we're finding out that while we thought the internet was a radically different infrastructure from the telegraph, it's very much vulnerable to the same kinds of manipulation. And so it really does require more than just throwing technology at it. It really does look at policy. It looks at looking at technology not as a neutral force, but making sure that you build into that technology this liberating aspect. We saw this very much in the early 2000s with the internet and providing anonymizing services and VPN services and redirection services and Tor and different mechanisms that allowed people within really restrictive information ecosystems to be able to anonymize their data and get out of international borders. And we see some of that very much happening in Europe, and we certainly see that all over Ukraine. But it comes back to a story that just because we have the ability to share and connect and share this thing doesn't mean we'll always have it, and doesn't mean that that technology has to be used in that method.
You have to forgive me if this question gets a little political. I feel like Russia's war in Ukraine is a wake-up call for us in America. Not like we needed another one after the insurrection of January 6th, but here we are. Certain people's efforts to undermine key institutions, our elections can't be trusted, the free press is enemy of the people. Now we see these craven attacks on libraries and teachers. Maybe it's not a straight line, but is it too much to say that what's happening in Ukraine is kind of showing us where this flirtation with authoritarianism is ultimately going to take us if we're not careful?
I think that's true. To me, what's, as an academic, more interesting, as a human being, more horrifying, is that when you see the reaction to what's going on, when you see unprovoked war, when you see the idea of bombing civilian populations, when you see a country that is being ravaged for political messaging and not necessarily connecting in, what I find much more interesting is looking at the reaction that's going on overseas. In the US, when you see people who initially were looking at justifying these things, they were looking at, well, we're not allowed to say it's too bad because we didn't before, and how do we keep narratives moving forward? And actually, it reminds me very much of the lead up to World War II, when you saw this isolationist perspective, when you saw the idea of, well, it's okay if it's happening over there and they're straightening things out and trains run on time. We saw a little of that here. And so what we're seeing is a narrative now beginning to overtake it. What I hope happens is that we begin to see the internal disconnect and, frankly, the hypocrisy of messages where we talk about freedom and freedom of access to information and the rights that we have and not being an authoritarian area, and then realizing at the same time there's a poor population that's seeking to ban books and limit how ideas that people encounter, limit the international nature, limit the diversity of the voices that we bring into that conversation. I think you're right that that's the path, if it's continued, that leads to those authoritarian actions. And so the good news is that now that that's happening, there's an uproar. The bad news is we have to sustain and continue that conversation. And we have to work on a way of rectifying a narrative around individual liberty with collective responsibility. And so the idea that, the people who are talking about mask mandates and my freedom to do anything I want suddenly say, but I don't want all parents to have their children have access to anything they want. That's because of our collective thing. We want to wait till we address some of these topics, right? Now, human beings are brilliant because we can hold two conflicting ideas in our head at the same time. But after a while, when you're trying to set public policy, when you're trying to govern, you have to iron those things out. And one of the things that we're seeing, is whether it's around abortion, whether it's around book banning, whether it's around some of these cultural hot topics, trans rights, Roe versus Wade, what we're seeing in all of these things is that a minority voice still has the ability to drown out other voices, but only if those other voices decide to remain quiet. That idea that we do have the ability to speak, and free speech does not mean unfettered and speech without consequence, but it does mean that it also comes with a responsibility to defend it.
Well said. Earlier this morning we had a panel talk about the clearly political motivations behind the book banning and other legislations that we're seeing aimed at libraries and schools. We had a panel that that featured your former colleague Nicole Cook, that talked about library neutrality. And we talked about this sort of twisting the idea of neutrality in libraries, which we've spoken about in the past as well. But I'd love to get your take on all of this too. But let me start by asking it this way. Did you ever think in 2022 we'd be talking about book bans like the way we are right now? What do you think is going on? And is there anything that we should be paying particular attention to?
I didn't. I would love to have thought that we were beyond a lot of these things, but I think there's a complacency that comes that I think a lot of us fell into. That once again, all our rights, all of the way we look at this, when you accept that you don't work in neutral organizations, whether those be the press, whether those be libraries, that means there must be a continuous conversation about what are the outcomes we're seeking, what are the limits that we put on it. We can't simply throw up our hand and say, we've succeeded, we're done. I think that's been a real major adjustment for libraries, but we've also seen it in journalism. We've seen it in a lot of sectors where the idea is that once you get rid of the absolute, the only thing that you're left with is conversation, discussion, and compromise. And if you get rid of the absolute in an era where you do not have conversation and compromise, then we're seeing the results of that now. And what we need to do, and I think, pardon the very advocacy nature of this, there are no other organizations better situated to have that conversation and find that consensus than libraries. They exist, they serve all levels from womb to tomb. They are distributed and independent. I mean, the lovely line about the American Library Association telling libraries what books they have to have is a lovely lie that is just hilarious if you're on the inside of this equation. But talking about collection development policies, talking about dispute policies, how they are intimately local. What the one thing that's different about this, because we've always been able to talk about having dispute policies and challenge policies and having methodologies which involve radical things like reading the book first. What's happening now is we're seeing a disconnect from the information professional. That is, taking the librarians out of the equation, taking the information professional and making it a purely political discussion, making it a discussion among sort of the voices that can be heard. That's what's new in this book banning. We've always had challenges to book. We've always had book bannings. We've always had forms of censorship, and people have always warmed their hands by burning books. What's new now is that there's a lack of trust in these distributed professionals who are part of the community by a subset of that community, and they're loud enough to push a conversation. That's what scares me now, is that we're taking the guide rails off that discussion, and we're going to need to put them back on.
Well, to close out, this is a totally unfair question, but can you make us feel a little better? Just, what, if anything, are you seeing in your students somewhere in the world, anything that gives you hope that we're going to be able to defeat these illiberal, anti-democratic forces out there?
I do. I see it a lot. I mean, for example, during the pandemic, there was a discussion of how library budgets were going to be slashed and cut. It was going to be horrible. That hasn't happened. During the pandemic, there was the idea that people were going to run away from public good and public media and go solely to streaming and such. That didn't happen. The fact that we're having these conversations, and yes, we've had them before and we will have them again, is positive. The fact that it's not happening in the darkness, the fact that it's happening and there's an increasing vocal, that makes me proud. When I look at, so I'm now at Austin, and I'd just like to send some love to the Austin Public Library, and especially the director, Roosevelt Weeks. He came in to speak to my students, and here we are in the capital of Texas, and we can talk about Austin being, it's the blueberry in a bowl of strawberries, but it's still in a very conservative state. We had a director stand up and say, libraries are for all people, and I will fight, and every one of my staff members will fight to make that available. And then they did it, and they invited my students to be part of it. When I look at, and so just continuing the Texas thing for a moment, when I look at this, the most innovative library I've been in, I think ever, is in Pottsboro, Texas, population of 1,500. In this library that was a converted old post office and not that big, they have, yes, a small collections. They have virtual reality programs, an esports team. They beam broadband using wideband technology to everyone within a mile radius. They have all of these new initiatives and efforts because the community has grown to love and trust that library. So that now, 5 years on, Diane Connery, who's the librarian, the mayor comes to them and the judge in the district comes to them and say, can we do this? Can we do this? That's an example where you would say, oh, rural Texas, that's got to be the worst about all this. And you find out that when they truly look at the benefits, when they come together as a community, when they're given opportunities to move beyond the stereotype, communities come together and communities push for innovations and communities push for open conversations. That gives me a lot of hope.
Well, you did it. You did make me feel a little bit better. David Lankes, University of Texas at Austin. He'll be joining us again at the end of the day today with Roosevelt Weeks on a panel about library leadership, so you don't want to miss that. David, thank you so much for joining us today at the U.S. Book Show at the Libraries Are Essential program.
Thank you much.
Well, this concludes the morning program of Libraries Are Essential. We're now going to take a very short break, about 10 minutes. Please stretch your legs, grab a sandwich, but do come back for a special lunchtime program, By the Numbers, which will feature a data-driven look at the growth of digital lending from Overdrive CEO Steve Podash, our sponsor for today's program. Thank you, Steve. And also a fascinating talk from Portland State University researchers Kathy Inman Behrens, Rachel Norda, and marketing strategist Sonia Thompson, who will share insights from their research on reaching Gen Z and millennials.